Morning, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 9, where we're going to cover the circulatory responses to exercise. This chapter is going to be broken down to a couple of different parts, and here for Part 1, we're going to be covering the anatomy and physiology of the circulatory system and the heart. So let's start into a top-down view. So really, we're going to be talking about the kind of the circulatory, the cardio, and the pulmonary systems as a whole. And we put those in kind of one big term called the cardiorespiratory system. Or the cardiopulmonary system. Both these terms are used interchangeably. Sorry, I can't spell. So, either way, I'm just going to refer to it as the cardiorespiratory system. It's just the term that I've grown up using within my career. And just be aware that we're talking, both of those terms mean the same thing. And so, what is the purpose of these systems? Well, honestly, it's pretty simple. It's to bring O2 in and bring carbon dioxide out. That's the purpose of the cardiorespiratory system. And of course, going into the theme for our for this entire course is, we need oxygen for ATP production. That's kind of the purpose of all this, and I want you to keep that in mind. Okay, so let's look at the cardiorespiratory system as its whole. So with this, we do know components of this, and you've been exposed to this, but let's review pretty quickly. So first we have is the heart. We have the lungs. Again, we've got two lungs, right? Left and right. We've got the arteries. The arterioles. And of course, within the tissues of the body, we've got the capillaries. And then this particular section here, we're starting to get bigger again. We've got the venules. Then we got the veins. Then we go back into the heart. So what we're talking about is the flow of blood through the circulatory system. How it goes, it's getting oxygenated through the lungs, passes through the heart, goes through the arteries, down to the arterioles, through the capillaries, back to the venules, back to the veins, and back to the heart again. That's how the cardiorespiratory system works as a whole. Now, let's start looking at the structure of the heart. Now, the heart can be broken down into two quadrants. It can be broken down into what we call the pulmonary and the systematic quadrants, just for purposes here. So, kind of here on the left is pulmonary quadrant, and here on the right is what we call the systematic quadrant. And why is that? Because here on the left side, we have deoxygenated blood, and it's heading into the lungs for oxygenation. And then here on the right side, we have the oxygenated blood that is going to the body for use. That's why it's called these. We have these two terms for the quadrants. You don't see it too often, but it's mentioned in the book, and I just wanted to clarify that particular point. Now, when we look at the particular structure of the heart is a four-chamber organ, and we say that because of the following. So if we draw it, create different quadrants. First here, when blood enters the heart, it enters into the right atrium. or right atria. The second chamber, which is the lower chamber, is called the right ventricle. The third chamber is called the left atria. And the fourth chamber is called the left ventricle. This is important because it allows us to understand the functionality of the heart. And so with this understanding, what we can do is now let's talk about the flow of the blood through the heart. So we'll go from the system, and at this point the blood is deoxygenated, right? So, and this is what this means, it's low on oxygen. And so what it does, it enters the heart through the, it's flowing into the heart through the vena cava, both sides, right? And so we enter the right atria, pass flow the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. And from there, the ventricle pumps the blood up into the lungs through the pulmonary artery, which takes the blood still deoxygenated to our lungs, right? And hopefully you guys understand my drawing here is the lungs. And here where the blood becomes oxygenated and flows back to the heart via the pulmonary vein and enters the heart in the left atria. From there, it passes through the tricuspid valve into the left ventricle, and then from the left ventricle it is pumped into the body via the aorta, and from there the aorta carries the oxygenated blood out to the system. So this is how the flow of blood works through the heart. Let's try to tie this all together. And so as the flow of blood enters the systematic portion of the body through the left ventricle, if it flows oxygenated through the arteries, and then as it starts entering the working tissue or its targets, it starts entering the arterioles. So kind of combining what we talked about at the beginning of this lecture of the overall structure of the cardiorespiratory system. So here again we have our arteries, which carry oxygenated blood from the heart to the working tissue. The arteries start getting smaller and smaller, which is what we call arterioles. Spell this a little bit better. And then the actual gas exchange for oxygen and O2 occurs at the site of the tissues in the capillary beds or the capillaries. Then the deoxygenated blood starts going back up to the heart via the venules, via the veins, and then back into the right atria of the heart, back into the left ventricle, and it's pumped back into the lungs, and it's all recirculated again. And that's how the overall systematic process for blood flow and oxygenation occurs. So the next thing I would like to cover is a little more of the structure of the heart. Let's talk about the heart wall itself. And this is important because it helps us understand how the heart works itself. So to this point, we've talked about blood flow through the heart and how it gets to the circulatory system, right? Well, in all, how does the heart itself work? That comes down to looking at the heart wall itself. And so let's go ahead and make a bigger view of our heart. The heart wall itself contains four major layers. And you need to know these. The first is going to be the pericardium. The second is the epicardium. The third is the myocardium. And the fourth is the endocardium. Write these down. And we're going to cover each of these into our illustration of our heart wall. And so, when we start looking at our heart wall here, let's break out our four layers. So let's start with the outermost layer. Our outermost layer here, right, is going to be our pericardium. Just on the inner side of the pericardium, we have the inner portion of the pericardium, which has its own special name. We're going to highlight this in kind of a light blue layer here. And this is what we call the serous pericardium. Or it's also known as the peritoneal layer. Okay? And then just beyond that, we have just on the side, the inner side of the serous layer here, we actually have what's called the peritoneal cavity. All right? And so the peritoneal cavity right here is just an empty space. And this empty space is just there to help with the flux and contractions of the heart, because right below that we start getting into the three innermost layers, which is the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. And so our next layer, just beyond the peritoneal cavity right here, which I'm going to color in red, this is our epicardium. And then beyond that, which is definitely the thickest layer of the heart, which I'm going to highlight here in yellow, get to do a lot of coloring today in this lecture. I love it. This is what we call the myocardium. And this is the most important layer because the myocardium is the cardiac muscle. And with this is the layer that actually contracts and pushes blood flow through the heart and through the circulatory system. And finally, the innermost layer right here, which we're going to make green, which is the fourth layer that we've mentioned, is the endocardium. And this is the layer that's right on the inner, that you see in a lot of these graphs, right? The endocardium is that innermost layer that's inside the ventricles and in the atria as well. So all of this that we kind of see here in our models, right? That's the endocardium. And let's go ahead and clear some of this out a little bit, and let's talk about the different functionalities of these four layers. All right. We're going to keep the colors associated so it helps make it easier when you go back and review this. So, let's talk about function of each of these. One, which is our pericardium. Just going to use abbreviation here. Its primary function is outer protection. Okay. Second is the epicardium. And it is for lubrication. Third is the myocardium. Which I mentioned before is the cardiac muscle. And its primary function is contraction. And then finally, our fourth layer, which is the endocardium. Oops, running out of space here. Is inner protection. Okay? So that's what I want you to take away from the heart wall, is the four different layers and what are their functions. So with this being said, we covered quite a bit today. We covered, within this, we covered a couple of different areas. One was the anatomy of the heart. Second was blood flow. Third is the overall anatomy of the cardiorespiratory system. And finally, anatomy and function of the heart wall. So, if you understand these four components, this will help you with the rest of Chapter 9. Thank you for your time and attention, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.